Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we are going to look at patch 9.1.5 changes and see what they mean for Blood Death Knights based on the latest theory crafting. A quick disclaimer, this video reflects the state of PTR as of October 11th, 2021, and it's possible that Blizzard has made changes to the patch since this video has been released. In total, we'll be talking about the target cap softening, conduit changes, ability changes, and the implications of covenant swapping. First, the target cap has been softened on Bone Storm, Consumption, Abomination Limb, and Sacrificial Pact, which means they'll continue to hit targets above their previous target caps, which are shown in parentheses, and they'll always do more overall damage against more targets, though the damage done to each individual target gets reduced above their soft cap. So, what does this change for us? The following table gives a breakdown on how overall damage output will change on these abilities up to 10 targets, where the percentages in green represent increases in overall damage when they occur. So, Abomination Limb in particular will see a very noticeable increase in overall damage in large M+ pulls. But we really need to see a very high number of targets before any abilities that previously had a target cap of 8 start to see the same increases, to the point where the change is not very noticeable as far as those abilities are concerned. As a result, most of these target cap buffs are pretty negligible, while the Abomination Limb buff will at least be somewhat noticeable in dungeon settings. In any case, the target cap softening isn't impactful enough to change any of our current decisions. Now that we have reviewed the implications of the target cap changes, we are going to take a look at the conduit changes. Here, we have a 50% damage buff to Withering Ground and Impenetrable Gloom, along with a 600% damage buff to Debilitating Malady. If you want a quick reminder on what all of these conduits do, the conduit descriptions can be seen below. All of these conduit buffs have large multipliers on them, especially for Debilitating Malady with the 600% increase. But what impact are these changes actually going to have for us? To start, let's look at our pre-buff potency conduit priorities to see if anything has changed. Originally, we can see that the Covenant-specific potency conduits all have different power levels, but they are all stronger than Debilitating Malady, which means that Debilitating Malady does not currently see play, while the weaker Covenant-specific conduits or Adaptive Armor Fragment may be left out if you only have 2 potency conduit slots available. Withering Ground is already the highest priority potency conduit for Night Fae Blood Death Knights, so, regardless of any buff, nothing changes with how we treat this conduit. Impenetrable Gloom is currently the third choice conduit for Venthirs. However, the 50% buff is not enough to overtake Adaptive Armor Fragment in any group content, unless we are in a situation where we are highly prioritizing burst AoE damage over other types of damage. Debilitating Malady is currently never used and has some more interesting circumstances around it given that it is receiving a 600% damage buff. If you were able to somehow keep this debuff at maximum stacks all the time, you could make the case that the buff will make it stronger than Brutal Grasp and maybe even Impenetrable Gloom, particularly when you are against a large number of targets where Blood Plague damage scales better. However, Debilitating Malady is a 6-second duration debuff with 3 maximum stacks that is applied with Blood Boil, and, with any normal rotation, you'd be lucky to see even half of its potential damage output. Which means that the conduit still won't be worth taking over Brutal Grasp or Impenetrable Gloom. Altogether, that means none of our conduit priorities are changing with these buffs. And so, if we aren't changing any of our decisions, the only thing that these conduit changes do is to provide a small buff for Night Fae and Venthyr Blood Death Knights, with the Night Fae buff being relatively larger, since their conduit was stronger in the first place. Now that we've reviewed the conduit changes, let's take a closer look at the ability changes. For abilities, Consumption's damage was increased by 60%, Shackle the Unworthy's damage was lowered by 10%, and Shackle the Unworthy's spread rate was increased from 50% to 100%. For reference, here are the ability tooltips if you need a refresher on how these abilities currently work. Similar to the conduit changes, we're seeing some large increases here, but what do they actually mean for us, if anything? Starting with consumption, let's consider the current state of the talent row it resides in. As of right now, rapid decomposition, hemostasis, and consumption all provide minor and very similar amounts of extra damage output, with meaningful damage differences only appearing at very high target counts, where the target caps on hemostasis and consumption start to influence the comparisons. However, what makes hemostasis the standout talent for this row is its large mitigation contribution through amplified Deathstrike healing, which is much more than what is provided by rapid decomposition and consumption through leech healing. If we apply the 60% damage buff, consumption still isn't providing a particularly large amount of damage, but its damage is relatively higher than what is provided by the other talents on this row. However, its mitigation is still nowhere near competing with hemostasis, even with the 60% buff. With that, we are mostly concerned with whether or not consumption's damage increase is worth the loss of mitigation from hemostasis. If we compare the mitigation versus damage trade-off of taking consumption over hemostasis against other trade-offs that are available to us, it turns out the consumption is very similar in efficiency to taking bloodworms over voracious. The key differences being that consumption is slightly less efficient of a damage option than bloodworms on single targets, and slightly more efficient on multiple targets. So, we'd expect consumption to be used in circumstances similar to when someone would use bloodworms. And, while bloodworms is basically never used in Mythic Plus dungeons, bloodworms actually does get used in a number of raid encounters, particularly when the boss in question isn't very threatening to the tank. As such, we'd expect to see consumption used as a step beyond bloodworms if we are looking to make our raid build even more aggressive for a given boss. As for Shackle the Unworthy, the change is obviously a small nerf to Kyrian Blood Death Knights on pure single target encounters, but at every other target count, it should be a small damage buff. However, the changes in performance do not appear to be large enough to warrant making different decisions than what you are making right now with your covenants. Granted, this makes Kyrian worse at their specialty, which was single target encounters, and less worse at their weakest situation, which was multiple target encounters. And in 9.1.5, when we can swap covenants at will, this is potentially bad news for Kyrian, since we can always swap off of a covenant if we don't think it is the best pick for the job that we are trying to do. So, in that way, this change can be considered an overall nerf to Kyrian for Blood Death Knights. Speaking of which, we are now going to go over the implications of unlimited covenant swapping. While being able to freely swap covenants isn't adjusting balance at all between the covenants, it gives us the option of choosing covenants for different content types, specific raid bosses, and specific dungeons, as opposed to being stuck as the same covenant for everything, which was usually determined by which covenant was the overall best for the content type you were doing, or, in the case of raiding, Abomination Limb may have been so useful for soul render that you didn't really get to make your decisions based on any other boss. The first overall effect of this change to covenant swapping is that we're going to see more people choosing to swap their covenant when they are engaging in different content types, as situations where raiders continue to play their raid covenant in Mythic Plus, and situations where Mythic Plus players continue to play their Mythic Plus covenants in raid should go down. So, we can expect that all Blood Death Knights engaging in any specific form of content will use more similar covenant choices than what they are using now, based on what the perceived strongest covenant is for the raid boss or dungeon they are currently trying to do. The second overall effect we can expect to see is that situational covenants are now much more likely to be used in areas where they are already strong, but they would have been too costly to use in 9.1 when you were stuck using that covenant for all other content. So, we will probably see some strange situational covenant picks come out of the woodwork for not just Blood Death Knights, but all specializations. So, how do we expect these effects to play out for Blood Death Knights in particular, in either Raid or Mythic Plus settings? We'll look at raiding first, and before we get any deeper into talking about the covenants, it's worth pointing out that fight-specific utility has the potential to trump large performance gaps between covenants, such as having the ability to use Abomination Limb on Soul Render. And picking covenants for this reason will now be a much more viable option now that we can pick covenants on a per fight basis. Besides Abomination Limb, Door of Shadows, Soul Shape, and Phial of Serenity also provide unique utility that has the ability to provide tremendous value in a fight under the right circumstances. All further raid discussion is going to assume that none of this utility is particularly useful on the fight that we are concerned about. So, in that scenario, we will care a lot more about the numerical performance of each covenant. Since this isn't a full-fledged covenant analysis video, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on covenant differences, I'm going to provide an oversimplified raid breakdown of covenant strengths and weaknesses after accounting for 9.1.5 changes. In this comparison, we are mostly considering strength in single-target encounters. Night Fae with Naya has high mitigation, damage, and effective hit point potential, but has a complicated and movement restrictive rotation that makes it difficult for players to actually see those full benefits in any realistic situation. Kyrian with Mechanicos has high single target damage output potential and is the easiest on this list to play to full potential, but also has low mitigation benefits. Necrolord with Plague Divisor has high mitigation and a burst AoE damage ability through Abomination Limb, but low overall damage relative to the other options. Venthyr is very similar to Necrolord, but with more of a multi-target preference, and it has Draven available as an effective hit point flex option that can provide more effective hit points at the cost of even lower single target damage than the other Venthyr soulbinds. Being that Night Fae is difficult to play, and the fact that a number of boss fights make it extremely difficult to maintain full uptime on Death's Due, committing to Night Fae for all raid content was not a decision a lot of Blood Death Knights were willing to make. However, if we can easily swap between covenants, we would expect to see a lot more experimentation with Night Fae given its potential benefits, particularly on stationary boss fights that don't excessively force tanks out of melee range. It's still the most difficult covenant to play, even under ideal conditions, so it's hard to tell how much play it will see, even if it is the optimal covenant to use on specific boss fights, but it's definitely going to be something to keep an eye on, since players have more opportunities to try it out. When talking about the other three covenants, we are going to assume Night Fae doesn't exist to keep things simple, and in that world, Kyrian is generally the best damage option. Specifically, on single target raid encounters, Mechanicos is a very efficient source of damage to the point where, if you found yourself in need of more mitigation on a given raid encounter, it would be more efficient to consider swapping all of your talents to your mitigation options before considering a swap off of Mechanicos. However, the more targets you are dealing with, the less efficient a damage option Mechanicos becomes, since his increased damage soulbind trait only works on one target at a time. Still, it's likely Kyrian will gain in raid representation in patch 9.1.5. Since Kyrian isn't situational, it's easy to play and it's an efficient single target damage option. Necrolord and Venthyr provide similar throughput benefits and are more mitigation-oriented raid options compared to Kyrian. Outside of utility-based picks, we'd likely only see these covenants show up in situations where tank survivability is important, or where burst AoE is particularly valuable. Neither of these situations are the norm, but they aren't too uncommon either. Just to reiterate these points on a fresh slide, utility-based covenant picks are likely to become more common. We can expect to see more experimentation with Night Fae and raids because of its potential strength, though it's hard to say how much it will actually be used because of how clunky it is to play. Tyrion will likely be the default in any run-of-the-mill raid encounter and is likely to gain a lot of overall representation as a result. Venthyr and Necrolord's main purpose outside of specific utility is if tank survivability and AoE burst are particularly valuable for a given fight. Moving on to Mythic Plus, utility picks are much less likely to be a thing, since dungeon content is a long chain of smaller encounters, or negating any single mechanic isn't doing nearly as much for you overall. However, depending on the dungeon, you can provide extra value to your group if changing covenants allows you to activate dungeon bonuses you wouldn't otherwise have. Though the question about whether or not it is worth swapping can be a tricky question, since not only does the dungeon benefit need to be strong enough for you to willingly take a performance hit, but between you and your four group members, you'll want to try and figure out who loses the least in swapping covenants. Before we can shed any light on that, we first need to look at the current state of our covenants in M+. Again, here is an oversimplified covenant breakdown for Mythic Plus, where we are putting an emphasis on larger pull sizes, which is the majority of dungeon content. Venthyr with Draven provides very strong mitigation in multiple target pulls, and strong effective hit point benefits at all target counts, though his single target damage potential is relatively low compared to the other options on this list. Necrolord with Plague Divisor provides strong mitigation at all target counts, while the grip effect on Abomination Limb has a few nice uses. Night Fae with Naya provides strong damage and good effective hit point potential, though its rotation has even more issues than usual on the shorter encounters found in dungeons, and with the larger number of targets, since it takes some time to ramp up Death's Due debuff stacks, and the Death's Due debuff application is target capped. Kyrian with Pelagos has limited debuff removal and relatively low mitigation compared to the other options. Compared to the other options, Venthyr is just really good on multiple target pulls, and it isn't overly difficult to use, which means it's likely to remain the go-to Covenant and Soulbind choice for most Mythic Plus content. And, similar to Kyrian and Raid, we can expect Venthyr to gain more representation in Mythic Plus simply because it's a good default pick. Necrolord, however, is not a bad flex option if the lack of effective hit points isn't a deal breaker, though there isn't too much reason to actively pick it over Venthyr in most dungeons. Still, since the Necrolord dungeons, Theater of Pain and Plaguefall, are both lower target count dungeons that also don't put too much pressure on the tank, we're a pretty good candidate to flex Necrolord to activate the dungeon bonuses in those keys when no one in our group is a good Necrolord candidate. Night Fae is harder to justify in Mythic Plus than Raid, and it isn't even the easiest thing to justify in Raid content in the first place. Still, its consistent damage output is nice, and it does have good effective hit point benefits when you have your Death's Due debuffs rolling. Theater of Pain probably provides the best setting for Night Fae to compete with the other Covenant options as far as raw performance is concerned, since the dungeon isn't very dangerous for tanks, there are 5 bosses, and the target counts are consistently low, though I'm still doubtful if that's enough for us to actually see it being used commonly in Theater of Pain. Unfortunately, both of the Night Fae dungeons have some large and dangerous pulls that won't work too well with Death's Due. In fact, the urns in the other side probably aren't even worth a swap to Night Fae in the first place to activate. You could make a swap to Night Fae if you needed it for the missed dungeon bonuses, but you probably shouldn't be the first person volunteering unless there are no other good candidates. Kyrian swaps probably shouldn't be considered at all, since we are being noticeably downgraded by taking the Covenant, at least in Mythic Plus content. Spires of Ascension in particular would probably be better run without a Kyrian at all than having us swap Kyrian just to get the spear bonuses, since they aren't very impactful. However, we are going to want a Kyrian for the Necrotic Wake dungeon bonuses, since they are very powerful and enable pulls that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. Still, necrotic wake has several large and dangerous trash pulls that we'd very much like to be a different covenant when dealing with them. So we very much don't want to be the person who is providing the Kyrian dungeon bonus if at all possible. Just to reiterate those points on a fresh slide, Venthyr is likely to see an increase in representation since it's a strong default option for Mythic Plus. We're good candidates for swapping Necrolord if a swap is needed to activate the dungeon bonuses, and we'd rather not swap covenants outside of that. In conclusion, consumption may now see use in Raid as a less efficient version of taking Bloodworms. Covenant swapping should result in more Kyrians in Raid since they're a good default Raid pick. We're likely to see more Night Fae experimentation in general, particularly in raids where it has the potential to be the go-to covenant on some encounters if people can play it well enough. In Mythic Plus, Venthyr remains the go-to covenant, so we'll likely see more Venthyr use in Mythic Plus simply for that reason. Also, we really don't mind flexing Necrolord for dungeon bonuses when it is needed, though flexing to Night Fae, or especially Kyrian, is a lot more questionable. Other than that, everything else should roughly be the same as it is now. If this content was helpful to you, if you have any questions, if there are any other topics you would like to see in the future, or if you have any opinions of your own on these 9.1.5 changes, leave a comment below or contact me through Discord. My information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.